In the winter of 1941, a German naval intelligence officer sat at a desk in the Kriegsmarine's operational headquarters in Paris, with a stack of decrypted Allied communications and a growing unease he could not entirely explain. His job was straightforward. He tracked the arithmetic of the Battle of the Atlantic, how many Allied ships the U-boat fleet was sinking each month, how fast Allied shipyards were replacing them, and whether the mathematics of destruction could outrun the mathematics of production before the American industrial machine reached full capacity. He had been performing this calculation since the fall of France. The numbers on paper still favoured Germany, nowhere close to favoured, decisively, almost comfortably favoured. U-boat commanders prowling the North Atlantic were sinking tonnage at rates that military historians would later call unprecedented in the history of naval warfare. The officer pushed the monthly reports across his desk and made a note in his personal log. At current rates of attrition, he wrote, "The Allies cannot sustain their shipping losses beyond 14 months. He was not wrong about the sinkings. He was catastrophically wrong about everything else. What the German naval intelligence apparatus failed to understand in the winter of 1941, what it would take 2 more years and the deaths of 28,000 U-boat crewmen to fully grasp, was that they were not fighting a navy. They were fighting an economy, and the economy was going to bury them. The German plan to win the Second World War through submarine warfare rested on a single mathematical proposition: sink Allied merchant ships faster than the Allies could build them. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded the U-boat arm and would later lead the entire German Navy, called this strategy the Tonnagekrieg, the tonnage war. It was a doctrine of cold calculation. Individual engagements mattered less than the relentless accumulation of sunken hulls. Every tanker sent to the bottom of the Atlantic meant aviation fuel that would never reach Allied airfields. Every freighter destroyed meant food that would never reach Britain's civilian population, ammunition that would never reach soldiers in training, machine parts that would never reach the factories keeping the Allied war effort running. If U-boats could sink enough tonnage for long enough, Britain would find itself physically unable to continue the war regardless of its willpower or the resolve of its people. The logic was sound. German naval planners had done the analysis carefully. The calculation was not propaganda. It was arithmetic. The only question was whether the submarines could sink ships faster than Allied shipyards could build them. For the first 2 years of the war, every available piece of evidence said yes. Between June and October of 1940, during what German submariners called Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time, U-boats sank more than 270 Allied ships totaling nearly 1.4 million tons, losing only 2 submarines in return. The commanders who achieved these results became national heroes in Germany, their faces printed on postage stamps, their tonnage figures broadcast over German radio to a population hungry for evidence that the war was being won. Otto Kretschmer commanded U-99 and became the most successful submarine commander in the history of naval warfare, eventually credited with sinking 44 ships totaling more than 270,000 gross register tons. Günther Prien commanded U-47 and had already shocked the world by penetrating the supposedly impenetrable British naval base at Scapa Flow in October 1939 and putting 4 torpedoes into the battleship Royal Oak as she lay at anchor, killing 835 British sailors. Joachim Schepke commanded U-100. These 3 officers were known throughout Germany as the Aces, the men who were personally strangling Britain's supply lines. When Dönitz reviewed their patrol reports in his headquarters at Lorient on the French Atlantic coast, he saw numbers that seemed to confirm his doctrine completely. The Allies were losing ships faster than they could train the crews to sail them. The calculus of war was turning in Germany's favour. But in the Kriegsmarine's intelligence department, certain analysts were beginning to see something that the frontline commanders were not. They were watching a second set of numbers, quieter numbers, numbers that arrived not in the triumphant communiques of successful U-boat patrols, but in the dry statistical reports that crossed their desks from signals intelligence intercepts and neutral shipping registries. The Allies were building, not rebuilding, not replacing losses ship for ship, building at a pace that did not match the model the German analysts had constructed. In the model, Allied shipbuilding should have been contracting under the pressure of sustained losses, raw materials diverted to other wartime needs, shipyard workers drafted into military service, the sheer logistical difficulty of constructing large ocean-going vessels faster than experienced crews could be found to sail them. But the intercepts told a different story. New hulls were appearing in Lloyd's registry that had not been there the previous quarter. British emergency shipbuilding programs were producing vessels faster than German submarines were sinking them in some categories of cargo tonnage, and America, which had not yet entered the war, was making preparations that the cautious analysts noted in memoranda that circulated no higher than their own department, because no one wanted to be the officer who told Grand Admiral Dönitz that the tonnage war might not be as winnable as it appeared. When Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor and the United States formally entered the war, German naval leadership initially reacted with something approaching satisfaction. America's industrial potential had always been the variable they could not fully control, but there was a widespread belief among German officers, shaped partly by Nazi propaganda about American softness and partly by genuine historical precedent, that American mobilization would be slow, chaotic, and limited by the same political divisions that had kept the United States out of the European war for more than 2 years. Goring's famous dismissal of American production capacity as a nation of razor blades and refrigerators was not an isolated eccentricity. It reflected a genuine consensus within the German High Command that democratic societies were constitutionally incapable of the kind of total industrial mobilization that modern war demanded. Hitler himself told his inner circle in January 1942, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, that he saw no future for the Americans. He described the United States as a decayed country corrupted by racial mixing and dominated by Jewish financiers, incapable of producing the serious weapons of war that would be needed to challenge Germany. These were not assessments based on ignorance. Germany had intelligence on American industrial capacity. German military attachés had toured American factories. German economists had analysed American production statistics. The problem was not lack of information. The problem was that the information was being filtered through assumptions that made its true implications impossible to accept. German naval planning had estimated that American shipbuilding could reach a maximum of approximately 3 million gross tons of new merchant construction per year under wartime emergency conditions. This figure was reached through careful analysis of existing American shipyard capacity, trained workforce availability, and the historical pace of large vessel construction. It was a reasonable estimate based on every known variable. It was wrong by a factor of more than 4. The man who would make it wrong was a California businessman named Henry Kaiser, who had never built a ship before the war began. Kaiser had made his name constructing dams. His company had been a major contractor on the Boulder Dam, completed in 1936 ahead of schedule. He had built parts of the Grand Coulee Dam. He understood concrete, logistics, and above all, the application of industrial assembly line principles to construction projects that had previously been treated as bespoke craft undertakings. In 1940, Kaiser submitted a bid to build 30 cargo ships for the British government's emergency construction program. Maritime industry veterans ridiculed him. Shipbuilding was a specialized trade requiring skilled workers, expensive dry docks, years of practice, and intimate familiarity with the peculiarities of marine construction. You did not build ships the way you built dams. Kaiser went ahead anyway. He built new shipyards from scratch on the Richmond waterfront in California and in Portland, Oregon. He hired workers who had never seen a ship under construction and trained them in weeks. He broke the process of building a vessel into discrete repetitive tasks that could be taught to an inexperienced workforce and performed reliably without the years of apprenticeship that traditional shipbuilding demanded. Riveting required skilled workers who commanded premium wages and were in finite supply. Welding could be learned faster and performed by a broader workforce. In 1940, Kaiser's methods were curiosities. By 1943, they were producing results that made German naval analysts question the data they were receiving. The Liberty ship was the vessel that embodied American industrial strategy in the Battle of the Atlantic. It was not an elegant design. British maritime officials who helped develop the specifications called it ugly. American sailors who sailed it called it a bucket. Officially designated the EC-2-S-C-1 type, it displaced roughly 14,000 tons fully loaded, stretched 441 feet from bow to stern, and was powered by a reciprocating triple expansion steam engine of the sort that had been standard technology for decades. It could make 11 knots in calm seas. German engineers who later examined captured technical drawings found nothing remarkable about the design. What was remarkable was not the ship itself. It was how many of them appeared. The first Liberty ship, the Patrick Henry, was launched on September 27, 1941, at a ceremony in Baltimore where President Franklin Roosevelt delivered a speech invoking the phrase that gave the class its name. In the first full year of the program, American yards delivered 188 Liberty ships. In 1943, they delivered 1,238. In 1944, another 1,238. The total wartime production of the Liberty ship program reached 2,710 vessels. Kaiser's yards led all producers. His Richmond facility eventually built 747 ships during the war, a number that exceeded the entire wartime output of most European maritime nations. The production records that his workers set attracted attention even within the United States. But in the context of the Battle of the Atlantic, they were something more than records. They were the refutation of everything the German tonnage war was built on. The specific record that best illustrated what had happened to German strategic calculations came in November 1942. Kaiser's Richmond No. 2 yard launched the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch. The achievement was partly a publicity stunt, a carefully staged demonstration designed to show what American industry could accomplish when organized with sufficient determination. Workers were brought in on special shifts. Components had been prefabricated in advance. The effort was not representative of average production pace, but the point was made with a precision that no German naval planner could dismiss. A country that could launch a 14,000-ton ocean-going cargo vessel in less than 5 days was not a country whose shipping losses could be managed through attrition. The mathematics had changed. The German analysts who had calculated in early 1941 that Allied shipping losses were unsustainable had been doing their arithmetic in a world where ships took 8 months to build. That world no longer existed. In the submarine fleet itself, the men living inside these calculations had a different and more immediate way of measuring what was happening. They kept records of their own. Every successful U-boat commander maintained meticulous logs of his kills. Tonnage sunk, ship types, dates, positions, the small personal notations of a profession that measured success in steel and lives. The procedure was standard. An observer spotted a target. The torpedo struck. The ship sank or was damaged enough to be reported as a probable kill. The tonnage figure was added to the commander's running total. The total was reported to Dönitz's headquarters, and the headquarters forwarded it to German naval intelligence for incorporation into the strategic assessment of the tonnage war's progress. In the early years, those figures sustained the belief that the strategy was working. Kretschmer was sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. Prien was conducting operations that would have seemed impossible before he accomplished them. The aggregate tonnage figures compiled by German U-boats in 1940, 1941, and the first half of 1942 exceeded anything that Allied planners had prepared to absorb. Winston Churchill later wrote in his memoirs that the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. The shipping losses of 1942, when German submarines sank more than 1,660 Allied vessels, totaling over 7.7 million gross tons, were real, sustained, and threatening to break the supply lines that kept Britain functioning. Churchill's fear was not irrational. The question was not whether the losses were serious. The question was whether they were serious enough, and the answer to that question required knowing what the Americans were building, at what pace, in how many yards. The German Naval Intelligence Department continued to update their estimates. They continued to get the answer wrong. The officers whose conversations were recorded at Fort Hunt on the banks of the Potomac, that secret facility where German prisoners believed they were simply resting in relative comfort, while hidden microphones captured everything they said, returned to the shipping question again and again. Transcripts declassified decades after the war reveal the particular quality of disbelief that ran through these conversations. A U-boat officer captured in late 1943 and transported to the Virginia facility was recorded telling a fellow prisoner about the last patrol report he had seen before his capture. He described the shipping lane he had worked and the vessels he had watched pass untouched, because his boat was low on torpedoes and needed to conserve for a larger target. "The targets never stopped coming," he said. That was what none of us had understood. They never stopped coming. The prisoner paused. Then he said something that the monitors at their listening station wrote down and underlined. "We were taught that we were sinking them faster than they could build them. But I was at sea. I could see the ships. And I began to think that whoever told us that had never looked at the Atlantic, because the Atlantic was full of ships." The man most directly responsible for managing the German side of this equation was Dönitz himself, a figure of extraordinary professional competence and absolute ideological loyalty to Hitler, whose war diary provides one of the most revealing documents of strategic self-deception in military history. Dönitz had built the U-boat fleet from a handful of vessels in 1935, when the Anglo-German naval agreement permitted Germany to begin rebuilding a submarine force, to a peak of more than 400 operational boats by 1943. He understood submarines more intimately than any other senior commander in the German military. He had been a U-boat captain in the First World War, had been captured by the British in 1918 when his boat was forced to surface, and sunk during an attack on a convoy, and had spent the years between the wars thinking about nothing else but how to do it better next time. His doctrine of concentrated wolf pack attacks on convoys, his meticulous rotation of boats between patrol and training, his insistence on direct radio communication with commanders at sea. All of it reflected decades of careful thought by a man who took his profession with absolute seriousness. When the American shipping figures that reached his headquarters through intelligence intercepts began to diverge from his projections, his war diary shows him returning to the calculations repeatedly, adjusting assumptions, seeking explanations that would make the numbers fit his model. In the spring of 1943, the adjustment stopped working. The numbers would not fit any model that ended in German victory. The month of May 1943 entered naval history under a name that German submarine crews would have preferred to forget: Die Schwarze Mai, Black May. During those 31 days, Allied anti-submarine forces sank 43 German U-boats. 43 boats, each carrying an average crew of roughly 50 men. More than 2,000 submariners killed in a single month. The losses were not uniform across the patrol areas. They were concentrated in the North Atlantic convoy routes, which meant they were falling most heavily on the boats attacking the convoys, the boats at the sharp end of the tonnage war strategy. The losses were catastrophic not merely because of their scale, though the scale was unprecedented, but because of what they implied about the trajectory of the struggle. For months, the ratio of Allied ship sinkings to U-boat losses had been moving in a direction that required increasingly creative interpretation to present as progress. In the first half of 1942, U-boats had sunk approximately 12 merchant vessels for every submarine lost. By late 1942, the ratio had deteriorated to roughly 5-1. By May 1943, it had collapsed entirely. In that single month, the U-boats sank 41 Allied merchant vessels while losing 43 of their own. The tonnage war's arithmetic had inverted. Germany was now losing submarines faster than it was destroying merchant ships. Dönitz withdrew the wolf packs from the North Atlantic convoy routes on May 24th. In his war diary that day, he wrote a sentence that his subordinates found almost impossible to read. We had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. He had not yet fully grasped the complete picture of why, and that gap between tactical awareness and strategic understanding was itself a product of the same intelligence failures that had allowed the tonnage war doctrine to survive as long as it did. The U-boat commanders who came home from their patrols in 1943, the fraction who came home, reported what they had experienced in the water: more aircraft, better equipped escort vessels, depth charges that seemed to have become more accurate, convoys that were harder to find and harder to attack. What the debriefings did not capture with adequate clarity was the underlying industrial reality that had made all these tactical improvements possible. The aircraft patrolling the mid-Atlantic gaps that U-boats had once used as hunting grounds were flying from escort carriers. The escort carriers were American-built. The radar equipment that was finding U-boats on the surface at night, and in conditions where they had previously operated with impunity, had been developed in British and American laboratories and manufactured in American factories. The improved depth charges and the hedgehog-ahead-thrown weapons that were making attacks more lethal had been produced in quantities that German ordnance officials, if they had seen the figures, would not have believed. Everything that was killing the U-boats traced back eventually to the same source. American industrial capacity had mobilized faster, more completely, and at a larger scale than any German planner had believed possible. Dönitz understood this in the abstract. He wrote in his memoirs, composed after the war while he was serving a 10-year sentence at Spandau prison following his conviction at Nuremberg, that the Allies had won the Battle of the Atlantic through superior technology, superior intelligence from the breaking of German naval codes, and above all, superior production. He acknowledged in precise language what had defeated him. He noted that Allied merchant shipbuilding had outpaced U-boat sinkings by margins that made the tonnage war doctrine unworkable. He acknowledged that the decision to maintain offensive operations through 1943 and 1944, after it was clear that the strategic equation had turned against Germany, had cost the lives of submarine crewmen without producing compensating results. But the memoir, like the war diary, contains a quality of detachment from the full scale of what had happened that reveals how difficult it was for a man formed by German military culture to fully internalize the nature of the defeat. He discussed the tonnage figures as if they were variables in an equation that had simply not been solved correctly, rather than as evidence of a fundamental misjudgment about the nature of the adversary Germany was fighting. The Americans had not won the Battle of the Atlantic by being better submariners or even by being better anti-submarine operators, though their improvement in that area had been rapid and impressive. They had won it by being better manufacturers. They had built ships faster than U-boats could sink them, and once that fact was established, the outcome of the campaign was settled. The men who had sailed the submarines understood this at a level that abstractions about production statistics could not fully convey. Survivors of the Battle of the Atlantic who spoke to historians and journalists in the decades after the war described the experience of the later patrol years in terms that differed entirely from the exhilaration of the happy time. A U-boat commander who completed 6 patrols and survived the war described his growing awareness that the Atlantic had changed. He had crossed it many times by the middle of the war, and he remembered specific moments when the difference became undeniable. In 1941, he could find the open ocean stretches between convoys, the spaces where a submarine could run on the surface and recharge its batteries without fear. By 1943, those spaces had closed. Aircraft appeared at ranges and in weather conditions that should have made operations impossible. Convoys that had once taken days to find could not be found at all because they were being routed around known U-boat positions, a development that would only become publicly explicable after the war, when the British government finally acknowledged that the Enigma machine's naval codes had been broken, that the positions of U-boat wolfpacks had been known to Allied convoy routing authorities since 1941. The commander described watching a convoy pass at night from a distance, unable to attack because 2 escort carriers were providing air cover in conditions he had been trained to regard as safe, and thinking something he said he had never allowed himself to think before. There is no end to this. He had stopped counting the ships, not because the counting was pointless, because there were too many to count. The production figures that the Kriegsmarine's intelligence analysts had gotten wrong by a factor of more than 4 tell only part of the story. The other part is what happened to the German U-boat fleet itself. At the end of 1942, Dönitz had approximately 200 operational submarines available for Atlantic patrol. Allied anti-submarine forces were destroying them at an accelerating pace. Germany was building new U-boats at roughly 20 to 25 per month. Allied forces were sinking them at higher rates than that by mid-1943. The fleet that was supposed to be the decisive instrument of German victory was shrinking rather than growing, just as American shipyards were accelerating their output to peak levels. In 1943, American shipyards delivered 12.4 million gross tons of new merchant shipping. German U-boats sank 3.2 million gross tons of Allied merchant ships during the same period. The ratio was almost 4 to 1 in favour of new construction. It had been reversed so completely that its continuation made no strategic sense by any measure Dönitz's own analysts could apply. He continued it anyway, partially because of tactical hope that improved submarine technology. The Schnorkel breathing tube, new torpedo designs, faster boats might change the equation. Partially because of loyalty to Hitler and the broader German war effort, which required the U-boat fleet to tie down Allied naval and air resources, even without achieving decisive results. And partially, his memoirs suggest, because stopping would have meant acknowledging that the doctrine he had devoted his professional life to developing had been answered not by a better strategy, but by a factory in California that could launch a ship every 4 days. The fate of the 3 aces who had embodied German U-boat supremacy in the happy time illustrated the trajectory of the campaign as clearly as any statistical table. Otto Kretschmer was captured in March 1941 when U-99 was forced to the surface by depth charges from the destroyer HMS Walker and HMS Vannock. He spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of the British, eventually transported to Canada. He was the most successful submarine commander in history, and he was out of the war before the American shipbuilding program had fully mobilized. Günther Prien was killed in March 1941, just days before Kretschmer's capture, when U-47 was sunk by HMS Wolverine somewhere in the North Atlantic. His body and those of his 44 crewmen were never recovered. Joachim Schepke died the same week, killed when the destroyer HMS Van Sittart rammed U-100 and crushed him against his periscope. All 3 of Germany's premier submarine commanders were gone before American production had reached even a fraction of its eventual capacity. The men who replaced them faced a different ocean, heavier with aircraft, denser with escorts, populated by convoys that seemed to multiply faster than they could be attacked. They faced it without the tactical advantages that had made the happy time possible, without the intelligence superiority that had initially allowed wolf packs to find and concentrate against convoys. and above all without any answer to the fundamental arithmetic that had made the entire campaign a losing proposition before most of them understood what they were fighting against. The German Navy's failure to correctly assess American shipbuilding potential was not a failure of intelligence gathering in the traditional sense. The raw information was available. German military attachés in Washington in the late 1930s reported on American shipyard expansion programs. German economists who analysed the annual reports of American steel producers and industrial corporations could have reached conclusions about maximum production capacity that would have made the tonnage war doctrine look far less promising than it appeared in Donitz's projections. The failure was a failure of institutional imagination, the same failure that led German tank designers to dismiss the Sherman as a crude machine incapable of modern warfare, the same failure that led Göring to dismiss American air production claims as propaganda, the same failure that led the German army to expect American forces to break and run after early defeats rather than adapt and return stronger. Every German military institution that encountered America underestimated what a fully mobilized democratic industrial economy could produce when its political leadership committed to total war. They measured America by the standards of European military tradition, by the metrics of professional soldier quality and tactical doctrine and organizational sophistication that German institutions had spent generations perfecting. They did not have a framework for measuring the thing that actually mattered, which was the ability to produce, replace and sustain at industrial scale across an oceanic theatre against an enemy whose strategic patience was backed by resources of a kind that the European continent bled white by 2 generations of war no longer possessed. Toward the end of the war, American escort carriers and destroyer escort groups were operating in the South Atlantic, hunting the remaining U-boats that had retreated from the North Atlantic killing grounds in search of easier targets. In April 1944, the USS Guadalcanal and its hunter-killer group caught U-515 on the surface near the Canary Islands. Werner Henke, the commander who had been marking his kills in a notebook since the early years of the war, survived the sinking of his boat and was captured by the Americans. He was transported to the United States and eventually held at Fort Meade in Maryland. On June 15, 1944, 9 days after the Allied landings at Normandy, Henke attempted to escape by climbing the prison compound fence. American guards ordered him to stop. He continued climbing. They shot him. He was the most successful U-boat commander to die in American custody. He had sunk 24 ships totaling more than 165,000 gross tons. The ships he had sunk were already replaced and more besides. What the German naval intelligence officer had gotten wrong in the winter of 1941, when he noted in his log that Allied shipping losses were unsustainable, was the same thing that every German institution got wrong about America. He had measured what existed. He had not imagined what would exist. He had counted the ships that were already in the water and compared them to the ships that the U-boats were sinking, and the arithmetic had looked favourable. He had not looked at the fields in California where Henry Kaiser was building shipyards from scratch on farmland, or at the workers flowing into Richmond and Portland and Wilmington and Baltimore from every corner of a country that had decided, with the particular unstoppable energy of a democracy that had finally made up its mind, that it was going to manufacture its way out of the crisis no matter what it took. He had not imagined, could not have imagined from the data available to him, that a country whose shipbuilding industry had produced fewer than 500,000 gross tons of merchant shipping in 1941 would produce more than 12 million tons in 1943 and would still be accelerating. No European military tradition had produced a framework for understanding that kind of mobilization. No analysis calibrated to European industrial limits could generate a number that large and take it seriously. The U-boat commanders who stopped counting the Allied ships they were passing did not stop counting because they were exhausted or demoralized, though many were both. They stopped counting because the counting had ceased to mean anything. There were always more ships. There were always more escorts. There were always more aircraft appearing at ranges and in weather conditions that should have been impossible. And behind all of it, always invisible and never fully understood until it was too late, there were more shipyards, more workers, more steel, more engines, more of everything than any model the German Navy had built could accommodate. In the secret recordings made at Fort Hunt and at similar facilities in Britain, the former U-boat officers who had spent the happy time marking kills in their logs spoke about the Atlantic in terms that their earlier selves would not have recognized. Not as a hunting ground, as a place where the hunt had turned. They described the experience of surfacing at night into a convoy lane and seeing the horizon filled with ships in every direction. Too many to count and too many to attack, guarded by aircraft that appeared before the submarine could submerge. They described learning to feel the ocean had become hostile in a way that had nothing to do with weather or British skill. The ocean was full of the products of American industry,